Good evening. So tonight, the state of Arkansas carried out which could only be described as a savage double execution. It's calling it a double execution because two inmates on death row were executed tonight within hours of each other. Um, this is the first time that more than one person has been executed in the United States since August of 2000, so almost 17 years. Um, Now, why did this happen? Why is it that the state of Arkansas saw fit to execute two people on the same night? Well, they're rushing, and it can only be described as a rush to use certain drugs that are part of the process of executing people before they expire at the end of April. So, for basically arbitrary reasons, these the processes have been expedited, um, and now we're seeing a spate of executions. Last week, another person was executed who actually maintained his innocence and who insisted that further DNA testing might have exonerated. That person was executed last week, but tonight there were the two people that were killed were people who did commit heinous acts and admitted to them and confessed that they were the perpetrators. So nobody, I think, would want to excuse their heinous acts that occurred in the early to mid '90s. But it's very difficult to see what is gained societally from executing these men. So just minutes ago, it was announced that Marcel Williams, the second man, had been executed. And let me just give you a couple facts about this person. This is from Rob Smith, who is the director of the Harvard Law School's Fair Punishment Program. So he writes, when Marcel was 9, his mother allowed an adult woman to have sex with him in exchange for housing. And by the way, this is going to be pretty gruesome. So if you're faint of heart or you don't want to hear the brutal details here, I would suggest tuning out, and I wouldn't blame you. At age 12, his mother routinely pimped him out to adult women in their 20s, 30s, and 40s in exchange for money and food stamps. As a teenager, Marcel was raped by 3 men. An expert described Marcel's mother as catastrophically unfit to parent. The expert also described unrelenting and savage ways in which Marcel's mother physically abused him. For example, his mother beat him, quote, almost every day, usually with a belt or switch and sometimes an extension cord. Once, his mother even boiled extension cords in hot water before beating him with them. And Marcel was also stabbed. Now, when you inflict this kind of trauma on a child whose brain is obviously still developing, that can have severe effects on brain development and actually impede brain development and inhibit that individual's ability to function as an adult. So that ought to have been considered, but because this person's legal representation in his trial was so awful, the jury never was apprised of that evidence. It never heard about his history of trauma and abuse. Arkansas has a particularly lacking or inept legal system, and people often don't receive adequate representation. And of course, the United States Supreme Court has ruled that certain classes of people cannot be executed under any circumstances, including people deemed mentally ill or inept, and minors. But there's no really distinct grounds on which you could separate somebody like Marcel Williams from people who are deemed mentally ill, and therefore not deserving of execution. If Marcel Williams had severe trauma inflicted on him as a child, therefore hindering his brain development and his cognitive function, then one would think, but if there's any consistency in the standards that are applied here, he also ought not to have been executed, but he was just a matter of minutes ago. So that person is a good person to follow, actually, on Twitter, Rob Smith. This is Rob Smith for running commentary on these executions. Preceding Williams, a man by the name of Jack Jones, was also executed tonight. And again, he confessed to a grisly crime, which I don't need to get into here. You could easily find it. But he wrote out a final statement, which is pretty heart-wrenching if you want to go look at it. This was tweeted out by Julie Turkowitz of the New York Times, who is on the scene in Arkansas. Jack Jones wrote, "I want people to know that when I came to prison, I made up my mind that I would be a better person when I left than when I came in. I had no doubt in my mind that I would make every effort to do this. I'd like to think that I've accomplished this. I made every effort to be a good person. I practiced Buddhism and studied physics. I met the right people and did the right things. There are no words that would fully express my remorse for the pain that I caused." Now, by all accounts, both of these men were very remorseful and took tangible steps to reform, which we would think would be the purpose of prison. And actually, one of Marcel Williams' victims, so he killed a person, but he abducted, raped, and tied up another woman named Dina Windle. And she gave a statement to one of the local Arkansas TV stations tonight and said, quote, "This man has turned his life around. He's found God." And she asked for him to be granted mercy and not executed. So now, it isn't to say that one particular victim should have the ultimate say over the fate of any given offender, because certainly many victims and their families often advocate for execution. And if you have a moral aversion or objection to execution, you can't solely rely on the dictates of victims. But I think it is at least significant that this particular victim believes that it's not within the public interest to have executed this man, but of course he just was. So this is kind of a brutal display, in one of the most developed nation in the world, that one of our states is rushing to execute people at a rapid pace, just simply because they don't want to allow the drugs they acquired to expire. That's just an incredibly arbitrary and really kind of malignant standard to enforce when you're talking about when to take the life of an individual by force of state. So, I'm always amused and sort of disheartened, but not necessarily surprised, when I see people who proclaim themselves to be small government conservatives cheering the government taking what could only be described as its most awesome power, assuming one of the most awesome powers conceivable, and terminating the life of people in its custody. So it really is just brutal and sick, and this is what we're dealing with. I mean, the death penalty is increasingly falling out of favor. It's increasingly abolished in more and more places. I believe the latest state to abolish the death penalty was Delaware in 2016. Yeah, that's right. And more and more states have done this, but there are a couple still that view the death penalty as a morally affirming task for the state to undertake, and they're willing to utilize that tactic when it seems righteous in their minds. So that is what it's unfolding tonight. A number of additional executions are at least scheduled to take place before the end of the month in Arkansas, but I guess we just passed a milestone, right? A double execution was successfully carried out tonight, and it should give everyone pause about how this, I guess, society constitutes itself, that this is seen as acceptable or appropriate or just. So I'll leave it there for now. I hope I didn't depress everyone too much. And again, I know I'm going to get the objection from people, oh, look at these heinous crimes that these people committed, and they'll explain in detail what these two men did. But that's not the point. The point is whether should the state seek retribution against people in its custody in service of trying to enforce some kind of ill-defined moral standard? And furthermore, do we want the state being the arbiter of any kind of firm moral standard? Especially in terms of inflicting death. I mean, if your idea of morality is vesting the state with that particular power, then I sort of question your broader moral outlook. Anyway, there's a longer conversation to be had there, of course, and it probably will be, but just wanted to give a brief update, and with that, have a wonderful night.